Most discussions about survival during the Second World War focus on weapons, rations, or military tactics. But for soldiers and civilians across Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, Alaska, and the northern forests of the Soviet Union, survival often depended on something far less dramatic: how a cabin was built and how heat was managed inside it. In many wartime field manuals and construction guides, armies emphasized a kind of building knowledge that modern construction has largely forgotten. Log cabins, built quickly from local timber, were not simply shelters. When built correctly, they became extremely efficient heating systems. A small fire, managed carefully, could warm a structure through long winter nights while conserving precious fuel. The soldiers who built and lived in these cabins understood something practical about wood, airflow, and thermal mass. These were lessons learned not in laboratories, but through harsh winters where mistakes carried immediate consequences. Today, most modern builders think of log cabins as rustic, aesthetic choices. During the Second World War, they were instruments of survival, and the heating methods used in those wartime cabins reveal practical engineering ideas that many modern structures, despite their technology, often fail to replicate. Northern armies learned very quickly that heat efficiency was as important as food or ammunition. Winter warfare during the Second World War forced armies to confront a logistical reality that planners in warmer climates often underestimated. Maintaining body heat requires enormous energy. Every degree of warmth lost to poorly designed shelter meant more firewood burned, more labor-gathering fuel, and greater exposure to frostbite or exhaustion. The Soviet Army confronted this problem constantly during the war's eastern campaigns. Much of the fighting occurred in heavily forested regions where permanent infrastructure had been destroyed or, never existed. Soldiers frequently had to build winter quarters from scratch, using whatever materials were available nearby. The solution was the traditional log structure known in Russia as the izba. These cabins were not invented for war. They were part of centuries-old rural building traditions. But wartime conditions forced soldiers to reproduce them rapidly under pressure, often in extreme weather. Military engineers quickly realized that a properly constructed log cabin could retain heat far better than tents or hastily assembled plank structures. Thick logs created natural insulation. Gaps were sealed with moss, clay, or packed earth. Roofs were built steep enough to shed snow while trapping warm air beneath them. The result was not luxury, but efficiency. A small stove could maintain livable temperatures in conditions where exposed soldiers might otherwise face life-threatening cold. The real secret of wartime log cabins was not just insulation, but actually thermal mass. Modern discussions about heating often emphasize insulation alone. But during the Second World War, builders relied heavily on another principle: thermal mass. Logs themselves store heat. Thick wooden walls absorb warmth from a stove and then release it slowly over time. This meant that once a cabin warmed up, it remained relatively stable in temperature, even if the fire burned low during the night. This principle was especially important for troops who simply could not afford to maintain large fires continuously. Firewood had to be gathered, cut, and carried, often under dangerous conditions near the front. In many Soviet and Finnish field shelters, builders deliberately used large-diameter logs rather than thinner lumber. These logs absorbed heat during the day when fires were stronger, and little by little radiated it overnight. This created a passive heating system that, honestly, modern lightweight construction often lacks. Thin walls lose heat quickly, but thick timber walls slow the exchange between interior and exterior temperatures. In practical terms, that difference meant fewer trips into freezing forests for firewood. Another detail that's often overlooked in modern recreations of log cabins is stove placement. In many wartime structures, stoves were positioned deliberately to maximize heat distribution. Rather than placing the stove against an outer wall, which is common in modern cabins, builders frequently located it closer to the center of the structure. This allowed heat to radiate in all directions and prevented large areas of cold wall surface where heat could escape quickly. The famous Russian masonry stove, sometimes used even in improvised wartime shelters, really pushed this idea further. These stoves were massive brick or clay structures that absorbed enormous amounts of heat during a burn cycle and slowly released it for hours afterward. In rural homes, people sometimes slept on platforms built above the warm stove mass itself. During wartime, simplified versions of these heating systems were constructed when materials allowed. Even when full masonry stoves were impossible, builders attempted to replicate the principle by surrounding metal stoves with stone or packed earth to increase heat retention. Again, the goal was efficiency. Every piece of stored heat reduced the need for additional fuel.